Welcome back to Starmergeddon with me, Georgina Finley, and TLDR's UK politics #1 fan.
There we go.
Ben Blissett.
I like last week's better.
Last week's was better. It's because I forgot to prepare this time.
No, I could tell.
I didn't have anything on the tip of my tongue, unfortunately.
Well, it just makes me more excited for my title next week. Yeah.
Next week we'll be back.
2 weeks.
Bigger and better. Yeah, in 2 weeks' time.
Yeah.
And on Starmergeddon, every 2 weeks, we talk about what's been going on in UK politics. We talk about one of Starmer's cabinet ministers, what they're up to, and we discuss an adjacent story that's maybe a bit less covered in the headlines, but which we have found interesting. All right, what are we talking about today?
So today we're talking about whether Starmer is out-Torying the Tories. I think this is a criticism that's been levelled against him really since he became Prime Minister. In a lot of different areas, Starmer has not made big, substantial changes to the state that a lot of people were led to believe that he might make. There are a number of different areas that we'll get into in a minute, but the reason that we've sort of decided to do that, to cover this week, is because he's made a lot of changes recently in the last couple of weeks. And the New Statesman had a particularly interesting take that I saw, which was that in his decision to cut NHS England, it's sort of similar to Javier Milei's sort of taking a chainsaw to the state. Now, I don't agree with that take. I think there's different reasons. NHS England, the reasons for cutting it is it was very bureaucratic. There's a lot of duplicated work. It's very, very expensive. It's 150, 160, 170 billion a year, something like that. So a huge amount of money. So I don't necessarily agree with that take. But there are other ways that you can sort of look at this and suggest that maybe he is acting like conservative in certain ways. I mean, the most sort of pressing example, and something we've seen this week, is his changes to the welfare state. Starmer is the head of a left-wing party. Left-wing parties generally are okay with taxing in order to pay for things by the state, enlarging the state. That is sort of the unifying characteristic of left-wing parties. So for a leader of a left-wing party to not increase taxes and to actually reduce the welfare offering, particularly on sort of health and disability benefits, that is something that you maybe more expect from a conservative leader. And I also, so that was sort of what sparked this. But in reading that and sort of, coming up with that idea of to discuss that on the podcast today, I had a quick look into some of Starmer's promises that he made when he was running for the leadership. So this wasn't when he was running for Prime Minister.
This is back in 2019?
Yes, back in 2019, yes. So when he was running to be the leader to succeed Jeremy Corbyn after he stepped down after the 2019 general election defeat. And well, it's quite interesting, to be honest.
Ben's got a list. Anytime Ben comes on the podcast with a list, it's going to be a good one.
Yeah. So he had 10 pledges to you. So we'll go through them one by one and we'll see whether he's U-turned on them, whether he's got rid of them, and we'll just assess, shall we? I think that's probably a good way of doing it. Yeah. Now, I would say that some of these you can maybe suggest that he's U-turned on and therefore he's acting more like a conservative, which is sort of the theme of this discussion. Some of them he might have U-turned on and it's just because he's U-turned on them. But either way, I think it's probably going to be interesting. So we can look at, is he acting more like a conservative because he's U-turned on a certain policy, or has he just U-turned on it for other reasons?
Can I ask, before we get into the list of 10?
Yes.
What's the difference between the promises he made at this point in 2019, coming in as leader of the Labour Party, and his manifesto pledges? Were there changes in between?
Yes.
Okay. So
yes,
we are going
and
back
we will
further.
We will get into
He's
that.
He's prepared. This
is
great.
Yeah, there are some key changes.
Okay. Let's get into it.
Okay, so his first one is economic justice. That's his first pledge when he's running for the leadership. Now, he goes into more detail actually in his, there's a big document explained, but these are just like the summary ones. So you can probably get a bit more detail if you look at the actual document, but these are the summary at the beginning of the document. So number one, economic justice. I'm just going to read it as is. Increase income tax for the top 5% of earners. Reverse Tories' cuts in corporation tax and clamp down on tax avoidance, particularly of large corporations. No stepping back from our core principles. In fact, not only have they not increased income tax for the top 5% of earners, they have pledged that they will not be increasing income tax. That was one of the things that Rachel Reeves promised in the run-up to her budget last year. So Starmer has not done that. So number one, I would suggest, at least so far, he's not met. He might decide to increase income tax, in this parliament. But so I think at the minute that's a tentative. He has not done that. I think that's a fair.
I think it's more than tentative. No?
Yeah.
I think it's pretty solid
Yeah, I'm just
commitment to
I
not
suppose
increasing.
the disagreement here would only be when he promised to do these things, did he promise to do them within the first year? If he was to, for example, in the next year increase income tax for the top 5% of
Okay.
earners, would he?
I see. So you're giving him, at this point, the benefit of the doubt.
Yes,
So
that's
it's
what I'm
not-
doing.
okay.
Yeah, I'm giving him the benefit of the
So
doubt.
does this count as one that you've struck off the 10, or is this...
No, I think he might. Do
Okay.
that. The only reason that I'm leaning more towards striking it is because Rachel Reeves promised not to increase income tax that year, and I think it was just the basic rate. But the language she uses is that she's not going to try and increase tax because we're the most taxed in post-war history. So I think it's unlikely that they're going to do that, and that's why I'm being a bit more harsh on them.
Yeah.
Whereas usually I would try and, in this, I'll try and give them benefit of the doubt.
All right.
Number 2, abolish universal credit and end the Tories' cruel sanctions regime. Set a national goal for well-being to make health as important as GDP. Invest in services that help shift to a preventative approach. Stand up for universal services and defend our NHS. Support the abolition of tuition fees and invest in lifelong learning. This one, I'm giving him a big old no on.
How many have we gone through there?
That's just one. That's social.
All one.
That's
Right.
under the bracket of social justice.
Okay, social justice. Interesting.
Yeah. So they haven't abandoned universal credit. In fact, they did an uplift in a sense this week for certain elements of universal credit. So they've certainly not abolished it, and there's certainly no suggestion that they will. And Starmer has actually spoken out against abolishing tuition fees. And in fact, when I interviewed Rachel Reeves the first time, that was one thing I did put to her. Last year, the second time, I did put to her about the scrapping tuition fees, and she just said it would cost billions, it would cost too much, like we're not doing that. Starmer also said that we are likely to move on from that commitment because we find ourselves in a different financial situation. So I'm saying a big no on social justice. I think he's changed. He's changed fundamentally on that. Again, I would put the things that he said there is quite left-wing promises, and I would say him moving on from that is him moving more certainly to the centre. Maybe it's a bit unfair to say that he's out-touring the Tories, and as I say, I maybe disagree a little bit with the New Statesman piece, but yeah. The third one is put the Green New Deal at the heart of everything we do, and then it sort of goes on about some green stuff, but you'll remember that they promised to spend, is it £29 billion a year? £28 billion a year on a Green New Deal, which they scrapped. There was a suggestion that they might introduce it later in the term, but the original promise was, or at least a promise after he became leader, was to introduce that early in the term, which they've not done. So again, there is a U-turn there. Whether that's him moving into Tory territory, I don't really know. Green stuff is... transcends left-right leanings a little bit, especially Theresa May was the one that introduced the commitment to the 2050 target for net zero. So it's a little bit confusing, but certainly it's a U-turn. I think that's fair to say. Number 4 is promote peace and human rights. So put human rights at the heart of foreign policy and review all arms sales.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big crossover, that one, I think.
Do you want to...
That's quite surprising. I didn't know Starmer. I don't think I could have imagined any world in which Starmer was that anti-arms and anti...
Well, he starts off by saying no more illegal wars.
Yeah, wow.
Reviewing arms sales was something he got into a bit of controversy last year with, because they sort of ended some arms sales to Israel, but haven't ended all of them, and that there's a lot of arms deals that we're still making with Israel. We're still sending arms. So reviewing all arms sales, and I'm sure, again, this is not a rabbit hole I particularly want to go down in this episode, but there are the phrase "put human rights at the heart of foreign policy." There was a couple of comments that he made in and around one of the conferences about the actions of Israel in Gaza that he got very criticised for. So. I'll leave that for viewers to...
Interesting. Also, given, obviously, the recent decision of the UK government to fund its defence spending increase by cutting the international development and effectively foreign aid budget, that doesn't really align with...
Putting human rights at the heart of everything we do.
It really doesn't, which is interesting.
Yeah. The 5th is common ownership. So public services should be in public hands, not making profit for shareholders. Support common ownership of rail, mail, energy and water, end outsourcing of the NHS, local government and justice system. Now, lot to get into there. And I'll try and be quick on this. Rail, yes, they're doing that, nationalising that. So we give them a little tick on that. That's fine. Water is the one I want to talk about because we've done videos on this. Thames Water and their gargantuan debt that they currently have. And there's been no suggestion really from government yet that the solution to that will be taking it into public ownership. And in fact, there have been some comments. I'm trying to find this. Speaking to the BBC, Starmer suggested a massive move forward on water quality could be made without nationalisation. So there's been suggestions before that nationalisation isn't something that he's now seeking for water. For rail, there is. For water, there isn't. And I've heard nothing on mail or energy. GB Energy, which they're introducing, is not nationalisation of energy. It's a separate sort of investment vehicle, really.
I think that is surprising to me, and I'm sure a lot of people on the water nationalisation front, because it's such a, if you look at public polling and public support for nationalisation of water in the UK, I think, this is a long time ago that I wrote the last Thames Water video, so I might be wrong, but I think it was something like 80% or 83% of the British population are in support of nationalising Thames Water.
Yeah.
And it seems like such an easy political win for the government and something they could have done early on, I guess, as kind of a big radical policy. And, you know, from my research at the time, it seemed that the government effectively has too many crises on its hands and has decided that nationalising water isn't something that they want to tackle now.
Yeah, and I would just on this, and very, very quickly, there's a documentary on the BBC at the minute that's called like Inside Thames Water, and I've seen a couple of articles written about it. It's absolutely excellent. Everybody should watch it. The main reason is because they let cameras in to Thames Water headquarters and they have interviews with the CEO, and they're basically saying, if nothing else, to see what an absolute comms nightmare it's been for Thames Water. The whole point of the documentary is trying to put their side across. But there's so many levels of ineptitude you sort of see within Thames Water, and I feel quite bad for the person who sort of signed it off is in the documentary. I feel quite bad for her because her whole point was trying to sort of show the difficulties at Thames Water, but what you actually end up seeing is it's even worse than what you actually sort of first imagined.
Interesting.
Their CEO is sort of complains about Ofwat and the fact that they're limiting the dividend package. It's like, come on, mate, this is not the time to be complaining about that. So yeah, really good documentary. Just side note, worth watching. So we move on. So number 6 is defend migrants' rights. So full voting rights for EU nationals. The second part of this, though, defend free movement as we leave the EU. Now, you asked earlier about the manifesto. Now, what was in the manifesto was Starmer's Brexit red lines, one of which is not returning to the free movement of people. So that is an absolute, unequivocal opposite of what he promised when he became leader. And not only that, but anything related to free movement, he is perceived as breaking his red line on free movement. So, for example, the youth mobility scheme, which the EU wanted us to actually implement, and we turned around and said, we're not interested. We're not doing that. It's too close to free movement. It's not something we're doing. So that is an absolute U-turn. And if we're talking about out-touring the Tories, they were the ones that pushed for Brexit. They were the ones that took us out of the EU. In the referendum themselves, it was Tory MPs that were split on the issue. Labour were, by and large, Remain. That is a U-turn, and that's moving to the right towards the Conservatives. I think just 7 through 10 we can quickly go through. I don't think anything here really has happened yet. So we've got strengthen workers' rights and trade unions, work shoulder to shoulder with trade unions, stand up for working people, tackle insecure work and low pay, repeal the Trade Union Act, oppose Tory attacks on the right to take industrial action and the weakening of workplace rights. I think they've actually, the workers' rights bill, there's certain other bills that are sort of going through that they're doing on that. So I think that's a vague tick. That's fine. Radical devolution of power, wealth and opportunity. So push power, wealth and opportunity away from Whitehall. A federal system to devolve powers, including through regional investment banks and control over regional industrial strategy. Abolish the House of Lords, replace it with an elected chamber of regions and nations. They've made some movement on the House of Lords, but certainly haven't gone anywhere near to abolishing, and I don't think there's any suggestion that they will. Getting rid of hereditary peers is all they've done so far. There's a suggestion there'll be an age limit, but that's all. Equality, put down obstacles that limit opportunities and talent. We are the party of equal pay, sure start, BAME representation, and the abolition of Section 28. We must build on that for a new decade. That's all quite vague, nothing really there. And the last one, effective opposition for the Tories, which is no longer relevant because they are the government. So I think 1 through 6 there are certainly, there's certainly evidence, right? That he's U-turned on a lot of things and in a lot of ways moved closer to the Conservatives. So when I was reading that New Statesman piece about Out-Torying the Tories, I was a bit sceptical, and on some of the points they brought up, I was quite sceptical on. But if you're comparing to Starmer when he was running for the leadership, I think there's certainly evidence in that direction.
Yeah. I guess the obvious thing to point out is that the world is an extremely different place now in 2025 and was in 2024 when Starmer ran, as leader of the Labour Party in the general election to be the next prime minister, to how it was in 2019. Since then, we've had a pandemic, which has upended social, personal, and political and economic life in so many ways. We've had Russia invading Ukraine, which has again upended the entire European, British, and also global economy in lots of ways. We've got Trump in the White House now for a second time. And I don't know, I guess maybe the point I'm asking is how useful is it to compare, Starmer's policies in the 2024 manifesto to his bid for the leadership in 2019?
For what it's worth, I do agree. And that is the point that, in all those things, when I was quoting Starmer about those, that is the central point he sort of comes back to, is the world's changed. It's not the same world as when he's making those promises. And I suppose our job now is to present that to the viewers and let them make their own minds up. And I would say that that's how much you're willing to let Starmer off with that is how much you buy that argument. If you don't buy that, if you think, okay, the world has changed, but you are the government and it's to do with your list of priorities, if you've promised that your priority will be scrapping tuition fees, there is a way that you can pay for that, even in the current constraints. There are certain things you can cut. There are certain, ways of getting that money to fund that. You've indicated that that is a priority, and it is no longer a priority. That is a change in values. That is being disingenuous. That is one way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Alternatively, you can look at it as, well, it is a priority, but what he was indicating there is when we can afford it, we will then pay for it. And now is not the time. The world has changed. There is no proper way to fund that. That was not the promise being made. The promise wasn't, we will do that no matter what. It was when we can afford it. So that's the other way of looking at it. And again, that's to our audience, that's to people watching this, to make that decision of how much you sort of buy that argument. But you're absolutely right that is what you've got to consider when you're comparing Starmer now to 2019, is how much do you buy the argument that the world has changed for not fulfilling those promises?
I think you've outlined those different ways of seeing it quite well, because many people would argue that in politics it's important to have principles and a political platform and an ideology that you believe in steadfastly. And I guess what we've seen since 2019 is a massive shift on so many of those points. How many of the 10 have we slashed?
I say 6.
So 6 out of 10, in our analysis, Starmer has U-turned or
in some
failed to.
I mean, I suppose we were saying about one of maybe given the benefit of the doubt.
Okay, so we think of half or more than half. When it comes to Starmer out-Torying the Tories, can you situate us in the now, so 2025, what was the kind of argument in this New Statesman piece, and in what ways?
I think they were being
how does that?
I think they were being a bit deliberately flippant, but they were basically saying, taking a chainsaw to the state, NHS England, welfare state. He's difficult economic times. He's slashing the state. That is a right-wing thing, cutting down on the state. That's not a left-wing thing. And therefore, and he's sort of continuing Toryism, I suppose.
Yeah.
And I think there'd be a lot of people that are sympathetic to that argument. I think they were probably being a bit flippant in the piece, just to be clear. I don't think they were putting forward an actually legitimate sort of case. But nonetheless, I think that there are, if you want to make that argument, there is evidence of that, and NHS England welfare spending are good examples. Obviously, all the things we've just gone through in terms of certain left-wing commitments and dropping them indicates a movement to the right. I'm not sure how fair it is to say actually Out-Torying the Tories. For what it's worth, I don't agree personally with that take. I think there is definitely evidence of him moving right wing, but when you have a look at the current Conservative Party and some of the things that they advocate for, and there is an ideological gap between them, and I don't think Starmer falls on the right of that gap.
Which we'll come back to later in terms of the kind of Tories' policies at the moment. But I guess one kind of common consensus that people have about the current Labour government and how it's emulating Tory governments of the past is in austerity.
Yeah.
How much do you agree, or do you think that what we are experiencing in the UK at the moment is effectively austerity?
I don't think you can make the argument on NHS England. I think NHS England, I know I keep bringing up NHS England and welfare cuts, but I think they're two different things, and I think they are worth separating out. NHS England, from my understanding, it was very much a bureaucratic body, and Starmer had looked at that and gone that there's a lot of duplication of efforts with the health department, and it's not worth spending money on. I think that is a legitimate cut that a lot of people would look at and go, fair enough. Welfare is different. Welfare, I think you could legitimately look at that and suggest that is a cut to public services in some way. I don't think we've got to the point where I describe it as austerity yet. But the thing is, we're only a week away at the time of recording from Rachel Reeves's statement. And there's a lot... Spring budget, yes. And I think there are suggestions that she's going to make some cuts to public services, and that the welfare... the changes to welfare this week are only the starting point, and that Rachel Reeves could go further. So I don't think it's fair to say that we're in austerity, we're in austerity yet, or we're back to austerity politics. But I think, in 2 weeks' time when we do this podcast again,
they're laying the groundwork for it.
I could have a very different answer.
Yeah, I think that is the sense in the media at the moment, right? And people are interested to see what comes out of this spring budget and whether it is effectively an austerity budget.
Yeah, well, the Tories are already labelling it as like an emergency budget, which Rachel Reeves made a big point of. We're not doing that anymore. We're doing 2 annual statements, with the latter one being the big changes. So, the Tories are already trying to sort of portray it as an emergency thing because Reeves has been so bad as a chancellor, etc. So, there's already some talk of that in the media, I suppose, and in the political scene.
Moving on, I guess, to the second part of our podcast.
Yes.
You've been speaking there about welfare, which is very much what we're going to be talking about now. So this is our cabinet review, where every episode we discuss one of Starmer's cabinet ministers and what they're up to, what bills they're working on, or what's happening in Parliament. So do you want to introduce who we're talking about in this week's cabinet review?
Yeah, so this week it's Liz Kendall, the Work and Pension Secretary, and she made the statement in the House of Commons this week announcing changes to welfare. I know that you've looked into this a little bit more than I have, but I've seen online that there was a lot of, praise in a sense of her performance in the House of Commons. And that's sort of one side of things, of her explaining the changes. And then there's the other side of things, which is the changes themselves, which have been criticised from a few different angles and in a few different ways. So I don't know really. I think it's an interesting one to talk about because it's sort of how those two things interact and how the public sort of view these changes. So do you have just a very quick overview?
Yes. So both of us have spent like a good portion of the past 24 hours trying to get our heads around this announcement. In short, the government has announced cuts to the benefits system and reforms to the way that benefits are allocated to people who are off work with sickness or long-term health conditions to create £5 billion worth of savings in 2029 to 30. And there's various different things that fall under this umbrella of sweeping benefits reforms that Labour have proposed. Alongside this, they've also set aside £1 billion of extra support annually for helping people into work. So this also intersects with a recent announcement, or an announcement we had a few months ago from the government in their Get Britain Working paper, which is aimed at tackling economic inactivity. And crucially, economic inactivity is different to unemployment. The official definition of economic inactivity is people who have not been seeking work in the past 4 weeks, but are out of work for various reasons. Could be because they're a carer, could be because they're a student, could be because they have a long-term health condition, or they're sick or disabled. There's many reasons that people could be economically inactive, but effectively these sweeping benefits reforms are going hand in hand with Labour's efforts to get more people into work. But the general reception, as you mentioned, across the media and with people, I think it's been a mixture of, I think shock, honestly. I think people are surprised because, as you said before, it's not a traditionally left-wing policy to cut the welfare state, not at all. And also confusion for that reason, but also over the announcements themselves. So the benefit system currently is extremely complex, as we realised,
as we found out,
trying to work on this script and various things in the office yesterday and today. And so some of the things that Labour want to do is they want to, as Liz Kendall said in her address to the House of Commons, they want to end the Tories, quote, perverse financial incentives for people becoming dependent on the welfare state. And effectively what they mean here is that the welfare system under the Tories reduced universal credit, which is the most basic form of monthly support that one can get from the government whilst being out of work, to a rate of £393, which is short of
a month.
Yeah, £393 a month, which is short of the £520.
The Joseph Rowntree Foundation.
There you go.
Yeah.
Has estimated is needed for essentials, i.e., the basics of getting by. And on top of the universal credit basic rate, there is an additional health top-up that people can apply for.
So just very quickly, that amount is from universal credit. So universal credit is what you get when you're not working. So the idea is that, as you say, you can apply for different forms of benefit for health and disability, which will top that up. And basically people out of work are incentivized to try and get the health and disability payment because the universal credit,
the basic rate, is so low. Yeah. So, yeah, building on that, there's a financial incentive if you're out of work and on universal credit to apply for higher levels of benefits payments because you simply need them to survive. And the way that benefits were assessed under the previous system was through the Work Capability Assessment, also known as the WCA, which is a system that users have described and the Labour government describes as like very time-consuming, very complex, long and stressful, and crucially based on a binary division of can or can't work. And this system basically encourages people to self-identify as being unable to work because they can access higher levels of benefit payments through the Universal Credit Health top-up than if they're deemed eligible to work and then lose out on potential extra income. So it keeps people dependent on the system, basically this form of testing. And so from April 2026, Labour want to reduce the Universal Credit Health top-up for new claimants while holding it for existing claimants, but also introduce an additional premium for people with severe long-term health conditions, which will keep them out of work forever. So Labour, I think, attempted to try to sell these reforms as protecting those with severe long-term health conditions who can never work through guaranteed lifetime support, whilst also trying to reduce the amount of payments going out to people that they can help get back into work through this other set of reforms, through the Get Britain Working paper. But it's all very complex, and it's not been well received by people who rely on benefits, understandably, because, you know, they are uncertain about what benefits will be cut, how they might be reassessed in future. So can you help me out here with a bit of context? Because the pandemic plays an interesting role in this too.
The UK was sort of unique to other countries in that there was a large uptick in younger people applying for something called personal independent payments. What that is it's a form of benefit given to people with health or disabilities to help them get by day to day. And the government is trying to sort of crack down on younger people trying to access benefits. So one of the changes that the government has made as part of these changes this week is increasing the minimum age that you can be to apply for certain forms of benefits. I think personal independence payments is one of them, up to 22 years old. And there's some other changes with age. I think the point is that mental health is a problem, and there's a lot of people that rely on the welfare state for legitimate mental health needs. There is as we explained before, with universal credit, some people are accessing personal independence payments as a way to sort of top up universal credit because universal credit has been so low and it's difficult to rely on. And that's something that the government has tried to look at this week. So I think the COVID example is a good one because it sort of shows how the UK is an outlier to other countries in that regard, I suppose.
There's also been some suggestion that part of the reason the UK has seen such a steep increase in disability benefits claimants since before and after the pandemic. So, for instance, Liz Kendall said in her speech that the increase in disability benefits claimants is double that of the increase in prevalence of working age disabilities in the population. So twice as many people are applying for benefits as, you know, registering with working age disabilities or health conditions. And she said also in her speech, this is mainly driven, as you just said, by young people, by mental health, and by people with learning difficulties. So as you said, the government are going to delay universal credit health top-up benefits to age 22 at the minimum. But they also, alongside this, and we don't really have time to get into it in today's episode, there's a lot of support that the government is trying to give to getting 16 to 22-year-olds into long-term work.
Yeah.
Through, you know, reforming the job centre plus and encouraging local authorities to work closer with local employers to get young people into work and all those sorts of things. But fundamentally, what is justifying in the government's mind these reforms is that the welfare system as is unsustainable. And if it continues at the current rate, the benefit system, 70 billion on working age incapacity benefits, which is equivalent to about a third of the NHS's budget and more than the annual budget for policing and crime.
It's all quite confusing. And
it's very confusing.
I think it's worth just pointing out as the sort of end point of this topic, we do have a video that's coming out on the changes and the background to the changes on the UK channel. So if you're interested,
we do. And we also have, we have a video from a few months ago as well on the government's Get Britain Working paper, the UK's economic inactivity crisis, if you want to look it up, because it ties in very closely with a lot of these new benefits reforms. But I think one final thing to say on this before we move on is something that interested me in Liz Kendall's speech was that she said the government wanted to shift towards a model of prevention and intervention. So effectively, you know, preventing people from having to get onto benefits in the first place. And this also interacts, it's a similar kind of thing, kind of rhetoric that we've heard around the NHS. You know, Wes Streeting, and it was in Labour's 2024 manifesto, that they wanted to shift the healthcare system in the UK to a model of prevention as well, as opposed to post-diagnosis treatment. So focusing more on getting people diagnosed early, preventing the health crisis from becoming as bad as it does, where people have to spend months and months in hospital being treated for this, that, or the other. And this is also quite a similar mindset, I guess, to how they're approaching the benefit system. And of course, those things intersect too, because if you are off work with long-term health issues, then you will need to be treated in the NHS. So all of this does get wrapped up together in a way that reveals the scale of the kind of healthcare, broad health, physical and mental health, and working unemployment crisis in the UK, and also the scale of the challenge facing the government effectively at the end of it. So that's why it's so hard to talk about, because it's very complex.
Yeah. Good job we have a video on it.
Yeah, a couple.
A couple of videos.
Probably should do a couple more, I guess.
Yeah, I'm sure we will.
Moving on to our final section of the podcast today, where we talk about another story in UK politics. And this week, it's Kemi Badenoch.
So yeah, what's been going on? She made a speech on the same day, incidentally, as the welfare changes were being announced in Parliament, which, just as a very quick side note, again, terrible decision. Why would you do that? All the media's talking about is welfare. If you're trying to get media attention, which is now the job of Kemi Badenoch, she's the leader of the Conservative Party. The opposition party struggles to get attention in the media, and trying to make a big announcement and getting things written about you. Don't do that on a day the government's making a big announcement. You just don't do that. Why would you do that? So there's actually surprisingly little to read about this, because no one wrote that much about it. But she made a policy announcement, and she was trying to sort of the policy announcement was that she wanted to, said it was impossible for us to get to net zero by 2050. And this policy announcement was supposedly meant to kickstart a policy renewal programme, which I can only presume is some more policies that she's going, it's going to kickstart her making more policy announcements over the next few weeks, months, years, etc., in order to, try and get rid of this idea that she's got no policies behind her. Again, I think the main thing to note here is just that it's incredibly bad timing, and net zero is an interesting topic to talk about, but it's something that Reform already a month or two ago had said that they were going to try and drill for more fossil fuels. They were sort of vaguely anti-net zero, anti-green stuff. And it's just, again, another bit of evidence that she's trying to mimic Nigel Farage and Reform. She's moving further right, but she's doing it slowly, and she's doing it with really bad sort of optics and bad communication. I've said on this podcast before that she needs to do policy announcements. This isn't what I meant. She needs to do them. She needs to be clear. It needs to be quite big, and she needs to try and make a big deal out of them. You don't do that on a day that the government are doing a big announcement. It's just going to get buried. And that is exactly what happened. And again, this just builds into her problem as leader. She's just not that good at sort of being the leader and understanding what her job is. And this is, again, something that some of her colleagues have been talking about. I mean, there's been people that have now been questioning her work ethic and punctuality. There's been this suggestion, this sort of rumour going around that she's constantly late to things, and that they have referred to start times for things, and then the actual time's going to arrive, and they refer to the actual time that's going to arrive as KMT, as in Kemi's own time zone, effectively, because she's constantly late. Again, I don't know whether that's true. It's just a thing that journalists have sort of been saying at the minute. But either way, it's sort of, these things build into a perception of a leader that can't get a grasp on things. I think her handling of this policy announcement was bad. I think rumours are swirling, and I think the council elections on the 1st of May are getting closer, and by all accounts, the Conservatives are not going to, given current polling, are not going to be doing well at that. And if that happens, I think we're going to start hearing some serious questions about her leadership. She's not a particularly new leader anymore. But if you were to ask your average person in the street, what does she stand for? What are her policies? What has she done? To
be honest, if you ask the average person in the street who is Kemi Badenoch, I don't think they would really be able to tell you.
Just to be blunt, that is her job. She sort of she was complaining the other day about Nigel Farage, and saying that he's not the right person to lead, and that he's more of like a personality rather than a leader. It's like, yeah, but that is what you need to do. Like, sure, he might be. I don't know if her words were exactly personality. It was like words to that effect, that he's a personality, he's not someone you need to take seriously. It's like, but that's your job. Like, and
that's why he cuts through far more to the electorate than Kemi.
You're not in
Starmer sometimes.
You're not in government anymore. Media doesn't come to you and ask you things. You have to get the attention of the media. That is your number one job, is getting people to know who you are, getting people to know what your policies are, getting in the news.
Yeah.
And she's fundamentally bad at that.
Yeah. I think you're right. I agree. I think it would be hard to disagree because I don't really know what's going on with Kemi Badenoch. I work here and I've barely seen anything about the Tories other than the videos you've written about Kemi potentially being ousted. And to bring us full circle to close this episode up, I think in a way this also ties in with what we began speaking about, Starmer's shift to the right and him out-Torying the Tories. In a way, that's only possible because of the vacant space that's been left on that portion of the political spectrum by the party that should be the opposition. And so instead, in my head, I'm seeing it as kind of like Labour filling up this entire portion of the political spectrum now, almost becoming more of a kind of big tent party. I guess a bit more like the Democrats maybe in the US that's got more of a right wing than Labour traditionally have in the UK. And that's only happening because there's this vacant space that the main opposition party isn't taking up.
Yeah.
So it does bring us nicely to a close for today. I'm going to ask my favourite question. Anything else to add, Ben?
Have we ever said anything?
Have you got a fun fact? What have you read recently?
I have, but it's not relevant to politics.
Okay, let's not then.
Fine.
Fun fact is Ben's got his tube socks on today.
I have got my tube socks on. I had my tube socks on, I think, last podcast as well.
Oh, lovely. So there we go. We finished today's episode with Ben's tube socks. Join us in 2 weeks' time for another funky pair of hosiery from Mr. Ben Blissett, and I will have found another word to describe him as by then. So
it's the reason to keep coming back.
Yeah, of course. Oh my goodness. And I have not done what I should have done, which is to tell you to buy Too Long. So if you stayed this long, you're a real one and we love you for it. And you should also get a copy of Too Long because we're nearing the deadline now. Things are ramping up in the office. We're running around like headless maniacs trying to stamp out our words on the typewriters. We're not really. It's all very calm. But it looks great. It reads really well. And you will not regret buying a copy. So do it. Buy it for your friends. Tell your friends and family. And you can use the discount code subscribe now for £3 off a copy. So do that. Get your nose stuck into some UK politics, and we'll see you back here in 2 weeks' time. Bye.
Goodbye.